Good afternoon. The Caregiver Support Group presents Dr. Barbara Harrison, Associate Professor of Nursing here at Westchester University. Her specialty in her field of study is caregiving and gerontology. So thank you, Dr. Harrison, and talk to us about the caregiver stress.
Okay, great. Joyce, you bring up a good point. It's caregiver stress, it's caregiver strain, it's caregiver burden. It goes by many different names. Today, our talk is really focused from a nursing perspective, but in reality, we work with social workers, we work with psychologists, because we all think about caregiving and the stress and the strain that's involved with it in different ways. And so I just first want to say that, you'll hear us talk about strain, stress, and burden. And we're really, for today's purpose, we're discussing the same thing when we talk about those three. I wanted to let you all know that my background is primarily in gerontology, and I know that caregiving, though, is across the lifespan, right? We know that some people are caring for children who are ill or have long-term disabilities, and I'm only familiar with that from a family point of view. One of my brother and his wife care for a disabled child. But most of my background is working with families, and particularly spouses, who are caring for somebody in their family. So not only has that been some of my research for my dissertation, but I also do the same function for Christiana Care. So some of you know that's a hospital system in Delaware. And so my exposure to that is I see families every week who are caring for somebody at home who's older. And so whether that person has dementia, whether that person has an end-stage cancer, I'm out there helping families and talking with caregivers about how is it going, who's your support person. One of the most important things, especially for new caregivers, but even old caregivers, is to really just kind of acknowledge that a lot of times caregiving is like that second full-time job. That it's just that recognition that it's a lot of work and that we need to expect that it's going to be a lot of work. So one of the things I want to point out is most caregivers have a story to tell about sort of recognition of the symptoms. What was that day or that week when they realized, oh yikes, my partner is ill or my mother is ill, and this almost feels like, day one for them or day two for them. So a lot of people sort of feel like they have this story that says, ooh, here's when I had to start thinking about this caregiver role and be in this role. So the next struggle to this is really, it's hard to get caregivers to talk about themselves. They're always talking about the person that they're caring for. Just a reminder today, we could spend all day on this topic. So let's just acknowledge that we're only going to be able to get to cover these 5 objectives. We're going to talk about acknowledging it as a strain. We're going to talk about the symptoms of it. We're going to talk about how the strain affects your health as a caregiver. There is an exercise that if we have time we'll do it. It's about identifying your feelings for caregiving, and then we'll also name at least a couple of resources for caregiving. One of the things, in case we run out of time, that we're lucky to have here in Chester County is a directory of support groups, and many of them are caregiver support groups. So,
Which I can send to everybody.
right. So, and actually, it's so that'd be great. Okay, thanks. But here's just sort of the acknowledgement, and that the difficulties of assuming and functioning in that caregiver role. It's first that social role in your mind, that I'm switching sort of from being a wife or a parent or a daughter to now adding that caregiver role. And sometimes it's that loss of that other role that can be sad. But we're also going to talk about sort of the caregiver's emotional and physical health, because as caregivers we get so focused on what's going on with that person that we don't think about our own health. And it often just occurs when those demands exceed our resources, whatever those resources might be. And so we know here in the U.S. that informal caregivers or supporters provide the majority of care to chronically disabled older adults, and that it is an activity that is recognized as both a benefit and a burden. So without getting too academic about it, there are interesting studies that look at sort of religiosity, spirituality, and how do people view caregiving. It's generally been sort of a Northern European idea that caregiving stress and strain impacts our roles. But if you actually look at other cultures, Asian cultures or African cultures, they look at it within the context of the family and less so in relation to the burden and the strain that's with that. But we'll move forward. We do know, this is a recent study from the RAND Corporation, that as caregivers, $52 billion a year is the value of what we're providing. And that if that had to be replaced with unskilled paid care, it'd be probably $221 billion. If you had to replace it with skilled nursing care, and a lot of times that's what you see being provided, it could be up to $642 million. So we're going to talk about 5 domains of caregiving stress and strain. And these are in no particular order, but for some families, the first issue has to do with financial. You're often making a decision about how much you can work. If you are working and caregiving, you're then paying for other services that are needed, whether it's the lawn because your husband no longer mows the grass, or your wife no longer cooks and does laundry. It's the physical domain of it. Sometimes it's just that physical exhaustion of working all day and then knowing you've got a whole nother 8 hours of work to do when you get home in relation to that role. It's the psychological. We're going to spend more time talking about psychological issues around depression and insomnia and anxiety. It's the social role. For some people, it's that loss of social time, that they don't have enough time now to go out with their friends, or if it's a guy, they can't go out to the golf course, or as parents, they don't have as much time for the other children as they would like to have because of the caregiving. And then personal. I mean, it's the most common thing to hear a caregiver say is they just don't get any personal time anymore. And so I included this one. This says, what is the meaning to you? So part of this is we have to, and we'll be doing this as part of the today, what is the meaning of caregiving to us? Those that are reporting more benefit or deriving more meaning from it actually start to feel less stress, bless you, and report better quality of life. So part of this is asking us to think about how we might reframe our thinking on it. And that doesn't necessarily take away financial burden, physical burden, etc., but it might take away some of the psychological issues behind it. Let me just say, so this is a group of mostly women, but adult daughters often have the most difficulty with caregiving because it's that change of role from being sort of the daughter, now they're the caregiver. It often represents somebody whose mother has already passed away and she's having to step into that role. It's also difficult, you're all employed or a student here, so but those who are no longer employed and staying home, sometimes you think, oh, well, they have all day to accomplish it, but it can be very isolating for people because when they can't, if they feel like they can't leave the house for long periods or they can't leave without somebody else being there, It can be isolating. Those with small social networks, people that, maybe my good example is in Wilmington. When I see people down there, if they're describing to me that they belong to the Catholic Church up by St. Francis and they have these groups that they belong to, or they're part of that Italian fabric in that section, they generally have a fairly good like social network size, you know. So there are other, so it might be from work, it might be from their church, it might be from their neighborhood. The sadder part is when you see that people have recently moved to Delaware for the tax benefits, but they don't have any kind of social network there, and all of a sudden then they're thrown into the caregiver role, and you can kind of imagine how isolating that is. So one of the things we think about sort of in terms of prevention is maintaining those social networks, not only for yourself, but for the benefit of your family and for the community. So, and then those reporting those higher levels of emotional distress because they're not getting support usually have more fatigue and sleep impairment and not eating as well. So here are some of the characteristics of the care recipient that's associated with the most caregiver depression and strain. And so they include behavioral problems. So this is common in like neurological injuries, whether it's traumatic brain injury. I have a friend who's dealing with that, and her husband. Higher dependence in activities of daily living. You see that with some of the dementia and the poor cognitive function, but it also can apply again to stroke, to other sort of Parkinson's. Many of the neurological disorders, even if it's a brain tumor, these are some of the hardest. And the only reason I bring this up is it's a way of acknowledging and validating that, yes, these are the characteristics that are making this situation even more difficult. And it's not just me, and it's not just I must be going crazy. No, this is what other caregivers are experiencing as well. So we know that the psychological symptoms for caregiving are commonly anxiety, depression, worry, and loneliness. So talking with caregivers, we'll spend more time talking about this about halfway through, but a lot of times caregiving support groups like this are a great place to cry, to let it out, to
Get help.
Get help, right. And so it's really often, but it's related to, and it's often a realistic appraisal of the experience that they're having. So women may doubt themselves, maybe why can't I handle this? I see other people handling it. No, you're appraising it correctly, but you're new to that role, and you have to acknowledge that. Let's move on. So we know that these are some of the caregiver risks. You can be prone to depression, grief. What's the grief come from? Sometimes we're grieving for what we had hoped would be for this person. I know if it's a child, it's that feeling of, we had such, high expectations and high hopes. People feel that way with retirement as well. They're grieving what they had talked about for years as what was going to be their retirement, and what their beautiful family photo looks like. So there's a lot of grieving that goes on, and it's grieving, and sometimes that grief, leads to, fatigue and depression, and then just the changes in that social relationship. Well, I'm going to move on to this little video that I have about the risk of depression leading to the physical health problems. And it's called, so these are some of the physical symptoms that people experience: headache, being sick more often, stomach or change in bowels, fatigue, difficulty with concentration, change in appetite, gaining or losing weight. These are all sort of common physical symptoms that we see among caregivers at any level, whether they're caring for sick children, my sister-in-law is always sick with with what seems like something, then she's works and is a caregiver. So we're going to talk about what are your symptoms. We know that caregivers that experience recurrent depression, though, experience more rapid health declines than non-depressed. That's why this has been really important in the literature. This Medicare project that I'm working on requires that we do a screen of the caregivers for depression, because even Medicare sees that if the federal government doesn't do things to help support caregivers, then their health gets worse and the person's health gets worse. So that's I know what they're doing. And so the fancy word for this in science is called allostatic load. And caregivers face these recurrent stressful events because, as Trudy pointed out, the truth of the matter is caregiving doesn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of times the caregiver has their own illnesses and health problems to deal with. Other family members have needs as well. It's often not, just that one stress within somebody's life. There's other stresses going on. And so this term has been used to define the load or the total burden of multiple stressors to which caregivers are exposed on a daily basis. And I've described these before. I'm going to move on to the short video. And so what we're going to move on to now are the handouts. These handouts are really, so how do we know what our stress is and how do we think about it? So Joyce copied both sides for us, but you'll see that I took this from the Hartford Institute for Geriatric Nursing out of New York University. College of Nursing provides numerous tools that are available to nursing and others. And so this modified caregiver strain index is on the other side. And this test, let's take a test. This test can quickly screen for caregiver strain with long-term family caregivers. It's only 13 questions. It measures the strain in relation to care, and it includes those 5 domains that we talked about earlier. It can be used to assess individuals of any age, so it's not just for geriatric, it can be used for anybody. And then, I'm not going to collect these tools. These tools are for you to look at and to think about how are you doing in relation to your stress. And it also helps people take kind of an inventory of where are you highest, where might you need some support in terms of your caregiving. So we're going to take a few minutes right now to go over this. The maximum score on those is 26. Of course, 0 means you're not experiencing any caregiver stress or burden, you're handling things well. But anywhere where you have a 1, you need to think about preventing even more stress and strain in that area. Anywhere that you have a 2, you need to think about how can I help reduce the stress wherever you have a number 2. Are there resources or things available for that? And so the next few slides are really about what can we do we really can't avoid it, but whatever possible, what is it that we can do to avoid stress and strain? And so let me ask somebody else. Andrea, what do you do to minimize caregiver role strain?
exercise.
Oh, good, good. I've got a slide on that. Good, good. Can somebody else suggest something else that they do? Bubble bath. That's a good one. Joyce.
Use other family members to help out.
Right, right. So a lot of people try and share the responsibilities with another family member or even paid help. And that's probably one of the most common ones I see if people have family available to them, that they get family help. So of the older adults I was seeing yesterday, my 91-year-old had 3 different family members there for the visit, and the same with this Ukrainian woman that I met with. So the caregivers were all sort of sharing things. One person is responsible for the meds, one person was responsible for keeping the house and the apartment up because they had to. But sometimes when we ask family members, sometimes that creates conflict too, right? Okay, so I'm one of 6, and I'm right in the middle. So I understand that. Sometimes that's an issue, and if that's adding to the stress, then it's not worth that kind of conflict. But it is important to be assertive when suggesting the kinds of support that friends and family can offer. And we're going to talk about that under coping strategies. One of the things that happens to all of us is we sometimes get into this emotion-focused coping or wishful thinking, and you just want to say, gosh darn it, I wish my brother would just step up and help with this. He knows all the work that has to be done. I'm working a job just like he does, and so we can get stuck in these emotional coping mechanisms of wishful thinking, but instead, we really want to talk about problem-focused coping strategies. What is it that we can do that kind of takes a little more control over this, and instead of sort of, bad-mouthing your brother, say something like, okay, now Bruce, I need you to go to the store and buy Mom, these supplies or these meds, and I do need them by next week. And just can you do that? Give me a yes or a no. Can you do that? So try to take control and think about how you can reframe that problem and make. One of the things that strongest suggestion we give to families and others is pick one little task. Your family or other people are not going to relieve all the burden. Pick one task. Pick if you have friends from church who are willing to do things. Ask them for that 1 hour. Ask them for, I just want 1 hour to take a bubble bath. I just want 1 hour to go to the store by myself without having to bring someone. And so a lot of times, our well-meaning friends will say to us, oh, let me know if I can do anything for you. And you're going to say, by the way, there is something you could do for me. What days are you available just to come for 1 hour? And ask them to help. And if they renege on it, then they're not really being honest with you. But hopefully they are. The other thing that people do is trying to understand the situation and use cognitive strategies by seeking information. I have a little Jeopardy game. I think we'll just do a few things from the Jeopardy game for the heck of it, but this is a little more fun. It's right here. So we're going to open a question. So everybody think about ways that, again, we've used either emotional focused coping, problem focused coping. This one goes into strategies and even has a bonus round. But let's start with at 100 for problem focused. What is problem focused coping? What do we say?
Focus on the problem issue, not the person.
Yep. So good, coping by taking a situation into your hand, attempting to resolve it with problem solving. Okay, great. So let's look at emotional focused coping. True or false? Emotion focused coping is more beneficial to people than problem-focused coping. True or false? False. Anybody else? Okay. Generally, that's the correct response. But actually, both types are valuable depending on the individual and their situation. Some researchers have actually taught people how to use both strategies, and it really depends on what kind of sort of trauma or loss you're trying to approach. So it's common to use both. What is an example of when to use emotion-focused coping? When a loved one has died and you cannot fix the problem. So there's a time when, but even the death of a role, it's okay to use emotion-focused coping when part of our stress is related to the change in our role, and we can't fix that. So it's the same as losing a person or the death of the person. It's okay to sometimes wishfully think, you know what, I sure do wish that I had Saturdays to go shopping now. And we'll talk more about that as we talk about writing down feelings. Because one of the things that we talk about is that feelings are just feelings. You know, it doesn't mean that you're acting on them. It doesn't mean that you think it's going to change things. But feelings, getting the feelings out can be sometimes half the battle. So one of the most important things in being a caregiver really is about taking care of yourself. Because we all get so caught up in taking care of the person is what I call the identified person, the person who is the sickest or needs the most. So whether that is restorative yoga, and the YouTube link there is to an older woman who's showing restorative yoga actually just sitting on a bed. It's not a fancy studio or a mat or anything, but she's just showing some of the restorative yoga moves that she uses, and how this is something that actually can be done with loved ones and shared. Because sometimes we want personal space and we can't get it, but we can at least maybe do yoga or other things with that person in the home if they're interested in sharing that. Sometimes it's just walking, sometimes it's exercise and stretching. Who's trying to eat well? That's the hard part. Kelly?
I'm trying to.
Okay, what are you trying to eat? Or not eat? Maybe that's what we should.
I'm trying to eat a lot better, like a lot of vegetables, a lot of
Yeah.
fiber, a lot of protein, stuff like that.
Oh, that's good. That's good, because actually that's what they say is try to avoid the fast foods, the sugary snacks. Eating high quality nutritious meals and snacks are better. That we want to, not shortchange ourselves by just, eating what's quickly available. So the next thing we're going to do is, I was thinking that these would be blank on the other side, but I want you to write it, in the corner or somewhere. But let's talk about writing down feelings, because this is a way of emotionally coping with this, but just acknowledging it. And so one of the exercises is to write down the feelings you've experienced in the last 48 hours and try to name them. And if you're struggling with that, write down or finish these sentences that say, I am furious at and because. And I am sad because. And then the last one, though, is I feel good because. And this exercise really focuses on, first of all, acknowledging the feelings, good and bad. And then also then acknowledging that feelings are just that. They're not things that you have to feel bad about or guilty about. These are just feelings, and that even when we feel like most of our feelings are negative, we also need to acknowledge for ourselves that there are some good feelings that we can be experiencing. And so we just want to remember, on a stressful day, start to think about what are your triggers for feeling impatient. Maybe your loved one is difficult, and how are you staying sort of loving and positive? Let me find this one. So this is my last little YouTube. I want to end this last 10 minutes with resources for caregiver support. So here's an example, what we're doing today is an example of a caregiver support as a physical space. But more and more caregivers aren't able to get out physically from the house for caregiving support. So there are a lot of web-based blogs anymore. The woman in the YouTube, actually, I have another page for her, is one. But Chester County also has family caregiver support page on their web page there, so that's one place. Not only do they have, there's that list that went around of the caregiver support, but they also have information on some of the waiver programs and what the state and county health departments support. These are some of the other links. I won't open them, but you'll have access to these. We're all here in Chester County, so between the aging programs and services, we've passed around this directory of support groups. There's also this CAPS for Caregivers organization, as well as Adult Care of Chester County organization. So all of us as caregivers have some unique situation, unique schedules, and unique problems to deal with. So whether it's a Chester County resource, and there are resources we need for all those 5 domains. Sometimes we need a resource for home health care. Sometimes we need a resource just to find out what other caregivers are doing or how they're dealing with their grief. There are also quite a number of caregiving support websites. Caregiving.com, the woman that so this caregiving space, that's probably the last one that I know we've used or had patients use. Let's see if that'll open. And it's a community of caregivers. And again, you can find caregivers who might have similar concerns. Here's where I found the page Listens. So this is the woman that was talking on the video. What are some of the other resources that people have used? They actually include like a fitness design just for caregivers. So whether it's in physical space or on the website, there are more places to go to look for caregiving resources. And I love this one, the Confessions of the Imperfect Caregiver. I was looking at that because we're all imperfect caregivers. We all know that we could be doing more or spending more time with someone. And so again, part of it's just acknowledging, you know what, I am an imperfect caregiver, I'm doing the best I can, and I'm doing everything that I can, and you just have to know that you're okay with that. Okay, back to my slides. So I think that that's another resource that might be, useful to people. And that's our, I did have a thank you slide after that. Maybe wrong version. But But I want to thank you all for coming today, because this is if you're a caregiver, you may not really want to spend then your lunchtime thinking about caregiving, because you're here at work. And one of the beauties, having been a caregiver myself, one of the beauties of sometimes going to work is just getting your mind off of your 24/7 job and being able to come to work and say, oh, okay, I can get my work done here without the interruptions, without the stress, without some of the things that I'm facing at home. Because here you can finish a job, you can move forward.